Get this out of here for now. I don't know why uh, the link thing when you like. Hang on, I just have to go back to the YouTube. The live stream thing, basically. I think I did that right. Nope. Okay, let's go check this out. Get this out of here. Okay. Now that I got that, get this out of here too. To like do it on a separate page every single time, and it's really, really annoying. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, no, I think I'll just leave it like that right now. I know the silence slash hearing my fan in the background. It's kind of like, I know it sucks, but you just want to stay on the safer side and not like play a lot of music in the background because people will be like, oh, you're using this link or whatever. And I don't have like, a solid Spotify list to use. I mean, for a reading stream, you really don't want one anyway. Because I don't want a lot of things clashing with the sound of my voice. So, I'm just going to go with that. Anyway, it's been 4 minutes. I'm going to start. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads Genesis. So today I'll be continuing my read through of Genesis. It's gonna be a long haul though, because I mean, what is this, like week 5 now? I've been doing this, and with that being said, like let's see, we're week 5, and I'm only like chapter 16, so moving kind of slow. But I mean, I'm right now in the middle of the Abraham arc, and that is, a couple more weeks, right? I did one last week, do one today, and then there'll be another one next week, because that's kind of how long the story takes. Of course, the next week's, as it ends Abraham's arc, we begin Isaac's arc in the founding of the Hebrew identity, if you will. Um, I just gotta think about anything I need to recap on. Not particularly, because obviously some things that I did talk about last week will come back again this week. So I don't think I really need to do much of a recap in that regard. So with that being said, I'm gonna start with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just get started. If you want to follow along, I'm using the New International Version. I'm starting from Genesis 16. If you got a Bible app, use that. Or, if you're on your desktop, BibleGateway.com. Like, just easy way of doing it. Free Bible right at your fingertips. So that's if you want to follow along. And I encourage that you do. I encourage that you also read it for yourself as well. And if you have questions, just shoot them in the chat. I'm just going to start with a quick word of prayer, and we'll get started. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. I just pray that as we read your word, that you would reveal more of yourself to us and show us more of your desire for our lives. And I just pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. So I'm just going to start reading. And if you have questions, just shoot them. I will give a little bit of a commentary in each chapter. I'll probably read about 4 chapters today. Kind of to just pace myself along the Abraham arc. Because some parts will get pretty intense. So I don't want to do all 8 chapters that I have remaining of Abraham's arc. Well, it's technically 7.5, but besides the point. The 8 chapters that have to deal with Abraham. So I'm going to probably just do 4 and 4. It's an easier way of doing things, I guess. And of course, with the commentary in hand, then once we add my commentary, then of course that'll take us into, over 2 hours. So we'll see how long I stream. I do have to go out for a little bit at 6 o'clock Pacific time. Right now it's 3:10, so I'll try and finish around 5:30. We'll see how the timing goes. I might, if I go a little bit longer, that's fine. If I go a little bit shorter, whatever. But we'll keep it around 5:30 time, so it's just under 2.5 hours. All right, Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. So go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I could build a family through her." Does that sound like a great idea? So Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, I guess I would make him roughly 85, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. So Abram slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise... Wait. Yeah, that's right. When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Oh, I didn't give Sarai a voice, but whatever. "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that was beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all of his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. This is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Okay, so chapter 16, not that long, but it's pretty contentful. There's a lot of stuff in it. So basically, the first thing I want to kind of point out is, Sarai's absolute like crap plan, right? This is a terrible plan, right? So one thing that we, as modern readers, we think, oh, it's so backward or whatever, the way that people thought in the ancient world. But I mean, it is what it is. And not to mention, I mean, there is some legitimacy of why people think this way. Like, sure, we may be modern people and we may have, evolved and developed the way we think. But at the same time, you know, some things don't change, right? As the old saying goes, as much as things change, things stay the same. And so, you know, of course, I'm probably going to get harped on for this probably, but um, a big part of human identity is through, children, right? And especially for women, men too, obviously. But especially for women, there's this whole like a big part of our identity is in how we invest into the next generation, right? Having children and having them grow up and succeed, right? That's just evolution in a nutshell, right? The propagating of the species and the species succeeding to the next stage, right? Duh, right? So with when the Bible story tells like Sarai coming with this crap plan of like having her husband sleep with another woman to have a child, because as the story said earlier, chapter 60, yeah, chapter 16 does mention it that like Sarai has no kids, and so Sarai is just like, I gotta have one, right? But I can't have one myself, so I'll have this slave woman be a surrogate essentially, and then of course this quickly backfires on her, right? Because then Hagar, not the most graceful approach, but Hagar is just like, well, I'm the one who's gonna be, your husband's favorite because I'm the one who's gonna actually have the son now, and so, like, kind of taunting her, and that's kind of that weird phrasing of like, she despised her mistress, um, and Hagar was kind of just taunting her, right? Just saying like, well, I'm the one who has the son, not you, right? And of course, ancient world, having a son was like everything, right? Because that would be the chief person to carry on the family lineage, right? So something an important observation to make is that, okay, so when it comes to these kind of why it's such a big deal for children, for people to have children and primarily someone to carry on the family name. Of course, we can play around with whether it's a boy or a girl in modern era. That's not the important part. What does matter is that there is someone to carry, you know, to carry on your name, your bloodline, etc. Right? So there's a lot of different layers to this, right? So I obviously mentioned the biological and evolutionary, right? So human beings, we just have this desire to evolve, right? to see the next stage of how humans will progress through the world, right? Even if we only live for a short time of it, there's this desire that we all have to see the human race evolve, and that's why we continue the species, right, with our own children, is because we want to see how, you know, our children will be set up to enter the next stage of evolution, and that continues on generation to generation, right? So there's obviously a biological aspect to it. That's a hadur, right? That's obvious. Um, and then, of course, in the ancient world, whether they knew that part particularly, not really important, but they've added on top of the biological aspect, right? So the biological is the evolution. Then, of course, is the sociological, and the way that people commute with, build community, right? And how community itself is also an organism in a way. And so how the community will grow, right? Through more people propagating human species, more people, that means community gets larger, it means it has to adapt and changes. And with more people, it can possibly do more, right? That's kind of the idea. And so by having children and having someone to be a mainstay in the family, to carry on the family name, if you will, was also super important, because this idea of how you and what you contribute to the community and how you contribute to the global community, right? The ever expanding community. We all must contribute to it, because obviously we've all taken from the community. That's normal, right? Let's say the planet, right? The global community, the planet, from we've taken from it. So we want to give back. And so by giving our own offspring, if you will, that person will be a continual caretaker, right? Because we hopefully have done our share, but of course we are not going to live forever. Which leads to the third aspect of why, it's such a big deal to have children. And especially, like in the ancient world, they definitely favored boys more, was because of this. And this is the part I wanted to talk more about. That's why I kind of breezed over the other two factors. But this part I kind of want to talk more about. And it's obviously important. The Bible brings it up, obviously. And, other stories, other mythologies, other, worldviews. This is not a uniquely Christian idea. Heck, you find a lot in, like, um, you know, other mythologies. They really emphasize on this idea of how human beings strive for immortality. And one way of doing it is to have your bloodline continue and the legacy that your bloodline carries, right? And so people kind of develop this way of thinking of like, okay, since I as an individual won't live together, or sorry, I won't live forever. I don't know why I said that. Uh, well, as I as an individual will not live forever, but perhaps there will be a part of me that will continue living on in each subsequent generation. And so, that we tend not to think of this from the older person's point of view. We tend to view this from the younger person's perspective. This idea of like the legacy that I bear, right? The tradition that I carry on, right? That I am the result of my forefathers and blah blah blah. Like this is a thing. Like if you ever watch samurai movies, they huge on this kind of motif, right? This idea of like, well, I mean, that's part of the code of Bushido, right? You honor the ancestors because you are the carrier of their legacy. You are the carrier of the purpose that your ancestors originally had. That's a very Bushido idea. I mean, that's not an exclusively Bushido idea, but if you watch samurai movies, and I love samurai movies, I love any, my guilty pleasures like samurai movies, knights, that kind of time period, like the just past the feudal period, the late feudal period, if you will, is like like I'm a huge history buff in that field. I love that stuff. So like samurai movies and like knights, they always talk about this kind of thing, right? Samurais do it a lot more if you watch like samurai movies. That's why I kind of point them out more. But this idea of like the lineage, right? I carry on the legacy of my forefathers, right? And it's like they make it sound way more epic than it really is. But it it was a very important, and to an extent to this day it still is a very important family, a very important tradition that human beings carry out, right? And we carry it out in different ways, obviously, especially as moderns we find ways to bend it and make it flexible. But you think of like these older, the medieval times, and you think of like those kind of movies, right? And how there's that whole thing about like my father before me, right? Luke Skywalker's famous line, right? I am a Jedi like my father before me, right? And so there's this idea of the carrying on the legacy, and we usually see that side a lot more often, especially in movies, because I mean, saying a line like Luke Skywalker's line, it's pretty awesome. And so, um, what I'm trying to get at is that like this idea of like why they made such a huge deal about like having kids and especially a son. It's not a foreign idea, right? And one of the things that is kind of problematic is how people in moderns and postmoderns especially, they would see it as like an outdated idea, which I disagree with that part. I don't think it's an outdated idea at all. That like people want to have like for example, families want to have kids. Oftentimes they want a son because of you know the tradition. This part you can bend a little bit. I'm not against it in that regard of like it doesn't have to always be a boy who carries the tradition, but I can. But what I'm trying to get at is that it makes total sense to think this, right? And when the Bible's pointing this out, it's not something that these ancient people did. It's a very um, I think it's a deeply powerful human emotion and idea that not only the Bible talks about, but many other traditions talk about and worldviews talk about this, and they put a high value on it because of how important it is to really view, you know, where we have come from and how we build up generation to generation, right? Of course, that I'm just talking in general here, right? Because of course there's also the biblical side to this view and how it plays out in Abraham's story, and there's a whole other dimension there as well, which I'll talk a little bit about. But once again, there's probably like thousands of Bible commentators have talked about this already, so I'll kind of just cover it. But I wanted to cover the more general view because I want this part to be like more like it should be super obvious, honestly. Um, so, the what the Bible also does is, when I talk about the whole like Mosaic tradition, right, and how like Genesis is meant to instruct the Hebrews moving into the land of Canaan, um, how to live, right, and it was really to honor the ways of the past that, well, just to an extent, um, not honor everything that your ancestors did, because once again, the patriarchs are not model citizens, but at the same time, you still have to respect people of the past. And now that I say that, obviously, like I know I'm kind of almost walking on eggshells here because in 2020 we've run into a big problem, a big problem in the world where we're not doing a very good job of that, right? And I pointed this out not so much last week, but I think on week 3 when I talked about Noah, I definitely talked about this then. And I'll kind of bring it up briefly now again, where it's like, you know, we should appreciate what the past has done, but of course we shouldn't be ignorant of some of the wrong things that our past generations have done. We shouldn't be ignorant about it. But at the same time, you don't spit on it and say like it's worthless. You don't, just say, well, the past was racist and we're better than them, so we don't need them anymore. That's a worse way of thinking, right? That's extremely arrogant, um, as opposed to like acknowledging that, like, okay, the past the past wasn't all amazing, right? I mean, yes, 2020 is a good year in comparison to most of the past, but at the same time, you don't just spit on the past. You don't say, well, you're worthless, I don't need you anymore, right? You should not do that with the traditions of the past. And every hero's tale is about people who honor the past, and they want to do more with it, right? I mean, if you think of the hero's journey, I think that's partly why we kind of have our problem in the world today when not respecting the past. It's because I don't think we really view ourselves as living in the hero's journey, if you will, right? Because you think of any all these movies do it, right? When they do the hero's journey, it's about, you know I respect the past, but at the same time, the reason why I do is because it gives me the power to move forward and to sorry um so remembering the past gives you the power, if you will, to move forward and to carve out a new destiny, and to overcome the challenges of your day, right? And so I think that's something that we've kind of lost sight of, and I think that's why we're living in such a confused, you know.
Hello, Jeannie, Mrs. Yuan. It's Ron again from Princess Cruises. Thank you so much for recently expressing your
Sorry, hang
interest.
on.
Please give me a call
Why is this
so
going
we're
off
ready
now?
at least to plan and hold something for next year. Running a really nice promotion with incentives and have options.
Stupid answering machine. Anyway, um, well, it's rare that people actually leave answers. Half the time you get those like people who just kind of phone you and then like no nothing. It's like, well, if you don't leave anything on the answering machine, clearly you're not very important. Um, but anyway, sorry about that. Uh, anyway, back to what I was talking about. The whole hero's journey, and the Bible obviously has that element, right? It's obviously got the hero journey, primarily in the person of Christ, but the the Bible, obviously does it in increments, right? And it leads up with not just the person of Christ, but also like within a specific context to see it within the history of the Hebrew people, right? And that was kind of what Genesis was getting at, obviously, because once again, this was meant for the Hebrews, after they left Egypt. You know, this we're talking about post Exodus now. After leaving Egypt, and now moving back to the land of Canaan, they were meant to be heroic, if you will, in one, living up to God's law, and two, to show that, to reveal God's law, if you will, and, as form of evangelism, if you will, to the rest of the world, because the Hebrew people encountered God, right? And so, in a sense, there's that hero's journey kind of laid out for the Israelites and the Hebrews, right? Of course, what the Bible later tells you that they do a really miserable job of it, but that's besides the point, right? But uh, the idea is there that there is meant to be this hero's journey that um, the Hebrews were meant to live out, and so telling the Genesis stories would have really helped them see that, right? Of course, when we're talking about Abraham, Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael, this is super early in the story, and this we got a lot of build up, and this could take weeks as far as me reading in front of you is concerned. But if you read through Genesis, you can kind of see the evolution of it pretty quickly. Um, as you just read through if you read through the whole book from just read all of Genesis in one sitting kind of thing, you would see this setup, and how it plays out pretty quickly, right? Um, and then of course, you read through the entirety of the Bible and you see how that keeps going. They keep upping the ante, if you will, until of course Christ comes along and does the ultimate thing, right? He overcomes death. But that's that's a big jump forward. We're not really gonna concentrate on that much when we're just talking about Genesis, obviously, because that wasn't. I mean, this goes back to the whole evolution of thought, right? Because in Genesis, I don't think they would have thought about that, right? Um, which I mean, maybe they did because, of course, like the beginning of Genesis has this whole idea of like the ultimate roadblock for humanity, right? Is the acceptance of the reality of death, and then how the hero's journey would somehow overcome even that. Maybe we don't know because you can't go ask a Hebrew person, 3,000 years ago, but would they have thought of, the hero's journey even coming up to that level, right? Maybe they did, obviously. Many a Christian commentator will tell you, well, yeah, obviously the Bible in its entirety tells of that, but when we're just reading Genesis, I'm not 100% sure that the ancient people would have seen that right away. Maybe by the time like the Messiah stuff started coming around, like Isaiah's time for sure, they would have thought about it. But in you know uh, Hebrews and like walking around the Mount Sinai and whatever, right? Would they have thought about it? Don't really know. But the the tradition, if you will, in as chapter 16 kind of brings it up, at least with this whole like importance of a son thing. And of course, this the Bible doesn't just repeatedly focus on sons for the sake of like the male dominated culture, but also because of the whole, once again, the Messiah thing obviously comes up. Um, but there's also just like accepting that the world of Genesis, what Canaan was like back then. If you just look at that part alone, I think everything else stands, right? You don't have to necessarily focus on the messianic elements, but just understanding ancient Canaan, right? The ancient world. That's how people would have thought, and it's not an exclusively a Bible thing, too, right? Like, um, I'm just using all the biblical references, but I mean, you can easily think of this in any other hero's journey, in many other mythologies and whatnot. So that's kind of the big thing in chapter 16. Even though I'm only talking about like why Sarai makes a big deal about having a son, that she comes up with this awful plan. Continuing on, we're going to talk about Hagar a little bit because she's an interesting character. Um, Despite my terrible voice acting, Hagar is actually a very interesting character. So she doesn't have a lot of parts in the Bible. She's like here and then one other part. She's like kind of important. Um, but you know, I think she's an interesting character because like she's she represents all of us in a way of having to accept the circumstances, right? And once again, I think Hagar is a very important character to really study, especially in today's world and today's, political and religious climate and whatever. I think Hagar is a very interesting character to study. And when I was kind of overviewing what I was reading today, I really thought about like what Hagar represents, and you know, just that sense of like, what do I do, right? Like, I have like very little autonomy in my life. The fact of the matter is that as much as we think we have control, we actually don't. And Hagar is a good reminder of that, right? Because, you know, we had this moment where Hagar acts super arrogant, right, towards Sarai, and then Sarai is just like, "Oh my gosh, like, get the hell out of here! I don't want to deal with you anymore." Even though it was Sarai's plan that, like, Hagar would get pregnant through Abram. So really, Sarai, it's your fault more than anything. But I mean, in a lot of ways, that's kind of how we feel with our own lives, right? Like it's someone else led us to where we are, and that's the funny twist, right? I talk about the whole hero's journey thing about the importance of having a son, and then now we kind of have the opposite of that in the character of Hagar, right? A slave woman. And so I think there's this interesting contrast between, this idea of the son who will inherit and the hero's journey, and of course a slave woman, right? a nobody basically. But at the same time, I think what makes sorry, not Sarai. What makes Hagar a really interesting character is that she she tries to find her way in the world, and of course, one of the beautiful things in the story is that God provides for her, despite the fact that you know she's not the hero journey character, right? Because I mean, obviously, in this arc, it's mainly Abram, right? And God's gonna, God makes this huge promise to Abram, and Abram's gonna do all the awesome stuff, right? The awesome stuff is gonna happen to Abram, and then, so it's so easy to focus on him, but we get these moments where this angel appears toward um, Hagar, and he kind of gives her these grand promises as well, right? And that it's kind of like a twist of a twist of a twist, right? Um, and so Hagar, the nobody, essentially, God gives favor to her. And I know the pastoral thing to say would be like, well, that's true in all our lives, right? We're all a bunch of nobodies, but yet God, has plans for our lives and has promises for our lives, and that's all true, obviously. But at the same time, I think the Hagar story is a good reminder of, you know, coming to terms with that struggle as well. That, like, even though God sees us in this world, it ain't going to be easy. You're going to be a victim of circumstance more often than not, right? And the funny thing is, like, the main part of this passage I want to talk about, and then I'm going to move on to chapter 17, is the funny prophecy, if you will, that, you know, the angel gives to Hagar. This is from verse 11 to verse 12. So the angel of the Lord said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. And he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." It's kind of funny where it's like, it's not exactly like the best thing you want to hear, because like God is basically saying that, like, this son of yours is gonna have like a really, really rough time. Everybody's gonna be picking fights with him his whole life, um, and that's, that kind of like, imagine if you were a mother and you heard that, like, yeah, your child is gonna be like the biggest troublemaker ever. Everybody's gonna be picking fights with him, and nothing is ever gonna be like super smooth because he's always gonna be fighting people, right? But at the same time, um, I don't want to jump too far ahead because the angel expands on this promise in a later chapter after Ishmael is born. And the angel promises that, like, despite that your son will be an enemy of everyone, he will remain powerful and I will protect him. And so there's that kind of funny twist in it, right? Because Ishmael is not the promised child, right? That's going to be Isaac later on. But despite that, God still sees Ishmael, sees Hagar, and gives his blessing to them. Essentially, God gives them a powerful blessing, and I will talk more about that blessing when I get there. When we talk about Ishmael when he's older, I think actually that will be where I end, because nope, never mind. Let's see, chapter 16, 17, 18, 19. Chapter 19 will not end on that, I don't think. Yeah, because Ishmael is kicked out of the house in like chapter 21, so near the end of the Abraham arc. But I mean, I will probably come back to this, um, chapter 16, when I talk about that chapter, um, because of course it's really important to see this kind of interesting. It's very short, but a very interesting character arc for Hagar, and by extension Ishmael, because Ishmael doesn't have much of a character. He's kind of like, he's the product of victim of circumstance, right? So if Hagar is the victim of circumstance, Ishmael is the product of that, right? And so Ishmael is kind of not really a character in that way. Um, of course, he's the one with the big promise, right? And I'll talk more about that next week when I cover that chapter. but I think Hagar is just a good reminder of how to face, the fact that we are victim of circumstance, and at the same time being strong in that. And I think that's where Hagar actually should get a lot more appreciation than she does, because I think she's an interesting character for that reason, and that reason alone is more than enough to make her a great character. Anyway, that's all for chapter 16. There's really not much else to say about it. I mean, I've already said a lot about it. It's just really about the hero's journey and kind of building up on it. So, once again, chapter 16 doesn't really stand much alone on its own. You have to understand chapter 16 a lot more when we get to chapter 20 and 21. And that's the birth of Isaac, and of course Ishmael gets kicked out of the house. But that will be next week's stream, because I don't think I'll be able to get there by the end of the 2.5 hours that I'm going to stream today. So, I mean, we're already 40 minutes in. I only did one chapter, so that really tells you a lot, right? So, anyway, moving on, because we got more coal to plow through. So, chapter 17. Chapter 17. When Abraham was 99 years old. So we have a time jump of 13 years for context. He was 99 years old. The Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make myself a covenant. I will make my covenant between me and you, and will increase your numbers greatly. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, And as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between you and me and your descendants. The covenant will be... Sorry, I totally skipped a line there. Let me go back. Verse 7. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. Sorry, okay. Blah, 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 blah. And it says after you. The covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring. Whether born in your house or bought with money, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant. God also said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. Abraham fell face down, laughing to himself, and said, Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, If only Ishmael may live under your blessing. Then God said, Yes, but your wife Sarai will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you, and I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his number. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When he has finished speaking, when God had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. Basically meaning he went home. The very next day, Abraham took his son Ishmael, and all those born in his household were bought with his money, every male in the house, and circumcised them. As God told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Yikes. And his son Ishmael was 13. Ugh. Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very same day. And every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his house or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. Mass cuttings. Ugh. So that's chapter 17, with the awkward ending. So chapter 17. Once again, a lot going on here. So basically, this is like a huge shift for Abraham, and it makes sense. It's about halfway through his story, if you will. First of all, he's called Abraham now. I didn't talk about this very much when I introduced the character, but Abram and Abraham have, their names are similar, but they have very different meanings. And of course, it's symbolic of the story within the story, right? So Abraham's original, his birth name, if you will, Abram means something like honored father or exalted father. The idea that Abram is this person of high honor, as a father figure. Of course, the irony is that he has no son, right? And sure, there's the whole, like, he takes care of his nephew. He's a good guy. He's relatively a good guy. And so he's an exalted father in that way. But, he's not really this high honored father because he has no son of his own. And that's kind of the Bible does this thing. And a lot of Bible teachers don't point this out, I find, which is kind of troubling because it's actually very important to the theme of Genesis. And that is that a lot of characters are named ironically, right? I mentioned this with Cain and Abel, right? Their names are actually kind of ironic. They're named ironically, right? That basically they're the opposite of what their names mean. And so Abraham is kind of the same here, right? His name is the opposite, right? So he's not much of an Abraham, despite that being his name. He's not much of an exalted father. But when God changes his name to Abraham, that name means father of many. Once again, it's ironic, right? Because he has one son, right? He has Ishmael, but he's not really much of a father of many. But God is saying that I've made this covenant with you, this promise with you that you will be a father of many. You'll have descendants like the stars, right? As numerous. Maybe, because there's a lot of stars considering how big the universe is. But that's besides the point. It's not meant to be taken literally. Really, that line was more to make fun of Abraham than anything. Yeah, I said that. God kind of makes fun of Abraham, that poor guy. But really, it's more to show how powerful God is more than anything. But sorry, I'm sidetracking. But God makes this covenant with Abraham, saying that I'll still uphold that. You will have descendants like the stars, but at the same time, it's going to be on my terms, and that's one of the interesting things here, right? Because once again, when I talk about way back when Abraham was kind of like a failure. He's kind of a failure, right? Once again, there's the ironic name thing. You know, he's a seven. He when he started, he was like 75, still living with his dad. You know, he's kind of viewed as this failure. At least, especially in the ancient world, that definitely would have been viewed as being much of a failure. Um, being in your old age, relatively, and still living at home with your dad. So you know, Abraham is meant, he's kind of viewed as this failure character. But of course, you know, the big twist of Genesis is that, you know, it's about what God does, right? It's about who God is and what he can do. And so God makes the promise that he's going to do something awesome in Abram's life. And so, um, you know, that carries on here, right? God's continues to make a promise. I'm going to do something awesome in your life. It's going to be awesome. But it's about me doing something awesome. It's not the fact that you're awesome, right? Because the fact of the matter is, Abraham's not that awesome, right? So the story is meant to kind of point out how awesome God is, and so when he retells the covenant, but there's that implication that like, well, it's gonna be on my terms. Is basically what God's telling him. He's like, it's on my terms. So I'm gonna tell you how I'm gonna do it. And so he tells him that, like, you know, Sarai, who you will now call Sarah, once again, um, hang on, I gotta check what Sarai means. But basically, her name is also pretty ironic. Um, it doesn't say, and I'm too lazy to look it up. But basically, like, Sarai's name is kind of ironic, and then Sarah is meant to be an appropriate name. So, but at the time, it's still ironic because Isaac isn't around yet. So, God kind of like, he's kind of setting up everything and saying like, this is how I'm actually going to do it. Because remember, in the earlier passages, God never actually tells anyone really how he's going to do anything. He just says, yeah, I'm going to do this, and then he kind of just like leaves it there, right? But then here he actually tells Abram, this is what I'm going to do. You know, your wife next year, this time next year, going to have a son, and you're going to name him Isaac, right? And of course, that's meant to make fun. You know, once again, it's kind of like God has this kind of sick sense of humor, where it's kind of like it's meant to kind of make fun, because he's kind of having fun with like Abraham, right? You know, they're doing this little adventure. It's kind of weird to think that God's kind of on an adventure, if you will, but I mean, God is traveling with Abraham on this adventure, right? Because God is showing him the place and everything, right? So that's kind of in a way God's having an adventure, if you will. But um, you know, God's on this little adventure, and he's kind of having fun the whole way through because God's like that, I guess. I mean, why else would he go on an adventure, right? So anyway, it's not like God has a character arc, right? It's not like God has much of a character arc going on. Uh, it's kind of the way he is, right? I mean, that's kind of what makes him God, right? Um, but anyway, he's on this adventure with Abraham, so I assume that like when he kind of does these moments of telling Abraham stuff and whatever, um, he's kind of like screwing around with Abram a little bit, but he's not being nefarious about it. At least we assume he's not being nefarious, but um, God is, you know, he's just having a grand old time with Abram, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing that a lot of people overlook in the Genesis story is that, and this is where you know, it's one of those things where like when I say it, it sounds like it's a weird thing to think, but I don't think it was weird at all for like the Jewish writers in the New Testament because, you know, there's a reason why people thought that like God was closest with Abraham than anyone else. Um, you'll definitely see this a lot in like the New Testament. They talk about how like God and Abraham had a special relationship, and one way to look at it is the fact that like you read the Genesis story, and God doesn't really do this with anyone else, in the Bible at all. He doesn't do it with anyone else in Genesis, and he doesn't do it with like David. He doesn't do it with, you know, he doesn't do it with Moses. He doesn't do it. Elijah kind of makes his own fun, if you will, but like Elijah, not that much, right? Elisha, nope, right? Only with Abraham, you kind of see this more playful side of God, that God kind of looks like he's having a good time just because he wants to have a good time. And so, once again, I know it sounds super weird to hear it this way, but it makes sense because that's how the people in the New Testament understood it, right? And they refer to it as God's special relationship with Abraham. God does not have this relationship with anyone else, and it's kind of this like play attitude, right? That God's kind of really playful, right? He's way more playful than he is with any other group because, of course, many people may make the argument that when God set the law down, then he kind of had to act more like a parent or something. I don't know. It's kind of weird to think about, but anyway, back to the covenant that Abraham's setting up, and he's kind of having fun with this, right? And so he kind of tells Abraham, all this stuff and um, how God's gonna do it, and playing with their names and being ironic about it, and then of course Isaac's name is also part of that ironic nature, right? Because he God intentionally picks that name because he's making fun of Abraham and Sarah's attitudes. Because Abraham first says it, and then I'm gonna read it in chapter 18. Sarai will have the same attitude, right? They're like, haha, God, like, yeah, right. And God's like, no, 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 this is how I'm gonna do things, and no one ever believes them. So, despite the fact that God has already done stuff for them, right? Like, well, not that much, but as far as like miracles are concerned, anyway, God doesn't do that much for them yet. Isaac is like the big one, right? So, of course, Abraham's gonna see, you know, God means business, right? When he makes any kind of statement, if you will. And this is where, like, God is playful here, but in the later chapter, he's not so much. He kind of God acts a little bit more serious. Of course, another thing to point out with this is the more human nature of God, if you will, right? Like, God is more human than we think he is. But of course, what I've been saying is that it's because we inherited it from God. So really, it's not that God is less God because he has these human kind of characteristics, but rather we're more similar to God because we inherited this from God. That's part of the whole image of God thing. We inherited this aspect of God, right? And so, and one of the problematic things is when people like point out these things and say that, well, God isn't all nice or whatever. It's like, well, you're not either, right? And you are similar to God in this way more than you are in being nice. And I'll get to that example more in a moment. But this is another good example of like, well, this is something we inherited. This is one of the parts where we inherited one of the nicer parts of God, and that we have this kind of playful element in how we approach others and have a grand old time and treat life like it's a grand old time, right? And God's kind of treat in this little journey with Abraham. God's having a grand old time. Um, I mean, he's definitely having fun from the looks of it. Abraham not so much, right? Because Abraham's like, I'm old, I'm tired, I don't want to do this. And God's like, oh, relax, man, it'll be fine. And so, um, it's just one of those things in Genesis I kind of like pointing out because I think a lot of people forget, to appreciate how God interacts with people, right? Like, it's one thing to say, well, of course he does, right? Of course he interacts with people, but to kind of see that, God, you know, lets his hair down a bit, right? For lack of a better expression. He kind of lets his hair down for a bit and kind of just like, homie, chill out. Let's drink a beer and have some laughs, right? Um, of course, God will kind of turn this and he will take a more serious attitude. But at the same time, God is also someone that, like any person, really, um, he also can. He doesn't always have to be serious, and I think this is where um, we a lot of people have the misconception that God is just no fun, sucking the fun out of my life. If I become a Christian, my life is going to be boring. It's like not true at all. I mean, God clearly knows how to have a good time. Uh, you know, pulling Abraham around like this. I mean, we may not think it's a great time, especially when you're an old man like Abraham, but God's having a grand old time, so that's what matters, right? Maybe. Um, but anyway, uh, I just wanted to point that out because that's kind of what chapter 17 shows. But I think chapter 17 has an interesting contrast in a couple chapters, um, where he's playful here, but he later ends up being like, okay, it's time to get serious, right? God can be just like, I mean, there's no reason why he can't be, because I mean, human beings are like that, right? We can have our just having fun, and then we have times when we have to be super serious, right? And so, I mean, it's we and I would like to say that like we inherited that from God, right? God gave us that capacity, if you will, to be like that, right? But anyway, um, another observation I want to point out in chapter 17 is the whole like bringing Ishmael back into the mix, right? And this whole thing I mentioned just earlier, that God kind of makes this promise with Hagar and Ishmael, and then he reaffirms it with Abraham, right? So he's saying like, yes, Ishmael will be blessed. Don't worry about it, right? Um, Once again, it's kind of the whole like what God can do, right? And showing how big God is. Um, that blessing multiple people is not a problem for him. Of course, there's a ancient world mythology thing of how blessings work, and we'll cover that in a much later story, because this is actually a very important thing to come up with, not Isaac, but Isaac's sons, because Isaac has two sons, and we'll see this kind of contrast later, but we'll cover that in like a month or whatever when we get there. Well, maybe it won't take that long. We'll see how long it takes to get there, but you get the idea, right? Um, Maybe I should do multiple reading streams so we can cover this book faster. This rate, it's going to be like March by the time I finish Genesis. But anyways, besides the point, um, well, maybe not March. It'll be like January by the time I finish the book of Genesis at this rate. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But anyway, back to the whole Ishmael thing and God reassuring Abram that like, or Abraham, we should start calling him now. God reassures us like, relax, like Ishmael's covered. I got him covered. You don't worry about that, right? You worry about what I'm gonna do for you, right? I will take care of Ishmael in the way I'm gonna take care of him, but let me take care of you now, right? And so that's something interesting that God kind of does in the story, and I kind of like how, in verse 18, and Abraham's like, but if only Ishmael would live under this blessing that you've promised me, right? And then God says, yeah, he will live under a blessing, and I've already given it to him. But I'm doing your blessing, and I'm doing the blessing with you, and the promise I made to you, and I'm gonna do it with someone else. Ishmael has his own blessing, so you don't need to worry about that, right? Because God is generous in that sense. Because you'll see in other points where God is not quite as generous. He'll be like, okay, blessing one guy, done, right? I'm too lazy to do another one. I don't know what his reasoning is. You read in like the book of like Samuel is a place where God kind of like, okay, he does it one way and then he kind of just stops, and he's like, okay, I'm done. But here he's like, God's just like, no problem, right? It's kind of one of those weird like, huh? But I mean, once again, it goes back to the whole like special relationship that God and Abraham have. Like, as I'm kind of painting it out here, God is way more chilled out when he's like dealing with Abraham than he is with basically anyone else, right? And so Abraham is super lucky in that way, you could say, right? Because no one else gets this privilege, if you will. At least no one in the Bible, that's for sure. Um, save for Jesus, but that's for a different reason altogether. But with Abraham, Abraham gets this special relationship with God. And, one part of it is that we get to see this playful side of God. We really don't get to see very often anywhere else. I mean, sure, there's the part where he kind of screws around with a couple of his prophets, but that's not quite the same as like what he does here with Abraham. Abraham is very like, God is way more, I don't know, homeboy, if you will, than he is like in any other part. don't need to talk about the circumcision thing. I think I'll leave that alone. I don't know how I feel about blades in that near that part of the body. It ain't nice, okay? Like, especially when Abraham's like super old, right? He's like almost 100 years old. He's got to take a blade down there. Like, hell no. That does not sound like a good time. Maybe that's the real joke of this chapter. After having like a good laugh, it's like, all right, time for the not fun part, circumcision. Insert your own joke here. And with that being said, to move on to something not as awkward to talk about, we're going to move on to chapter 18. Chapter 18. The Three Visitors. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Why you would do that is beyond me. It's super hot there. You're probably like sweating like crazy. You better have a large pitcher of lemonade. So Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. How he did not notice them from a distance, but there's probably explanations for this. When Abraham saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Abraham said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Then let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and go on your way. Now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour, and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. So sweet venison to some random guest. I would have loved to just walk up to Abraham and he would have given me some free venison. Anyway, Abraham then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. It's kind of funny that they eat this because in Exodus or in Leviticus there's a law against this. It's kind of ironic. I just wanted to point that out now because I think it's funny. Anyway, while they ate, Abraham stood near them under a tree. Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was well past the age of childbearing. After all, chapter 17 did establish she was 90 years old. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" You know what we're talking about. Yeah, we're talking about that. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." So Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." I didn't do a voice for her. I keep forgetting to do one for her. But the Lord said, "Yes, you did laugh." Now when the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? So Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and what is just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised to him." Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. And if not, I will know." The men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in this city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And the Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I'll spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke up again. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people?" And if I find 45 people," he said, "I will not destroy it." Then once again Abraham spoke, "What if only 40 are there?" "For the sake of 40, I won't do it." "May the Lord not be an angry wait, sorry. May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 could be found there?" "I will not do it if I find 30." "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. Okay, so chapter 18. It's a very interesting passage. I've said that about every chapter here, but I mean the entirety of Abraham's story is super interesting because there's just so much going on in it. So basically, the story starts and Abraham's just chilling out in the heat of the day. Why any person would do that? It's crazy because it's super hot and you're probably sweating like crazy. But he's doing it, and he sees these travelers. Once again, why are they traveling in the heat of day? So many a Bible commentator will point out, and I mean the Bible does tell us this basically, that like basically the 3 visitors that appear is basically like, well, God for sure, one of them. And then of course the other 2 people, there's been like some guesses here and there, so depends on which camp you sit in. So the Christian view started by the Orthodox Church of, I'm trying to remember who started this, which church essentially kind of thought this idea. It was one of those like, was it the one of the Armenian or maybe the Coptic Church started this? I think it was the Coptic Church actually. Oh, what the heck? Some random number just called me. It was like not even remotely close to my area code, so it's probably just like some international scammer. But anyway, because those are annoying. But anyway, so the according to the Armenian Church, the belief was that like basically it was the Trinity of the Father, Son, and Spirit. There's a little bit of a hole in this argument later, that some people will point out, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But basically, this idea of like um, Father, Son, and Spirit are you know they're they approach Abraham basically, and they appear as three persons, right? And of course, this is where a lot of people have problems with Christianity claiming to be monotheistic, but then of course there's like three persons in the nature of God, right? So we have the Father, Son, and the Spirit, and they act as independents as opposed to just being one God. So is it monotheistic? Is it polytheistic? Um, it's an arm wrestle there, right? So that's one way of approaching the three visitors. The other, more commonly accepted, because this will lead up in how chapter 19 plays out, is that basically it was it was God and he had two escorts with him because he does that. And I mean, why not? I mean, God has like thousands of angels. He easily could just pick two of them to go on a walk with him because he does that, right? Because God likes to just go around on walks. He just does that, right? So there's no reason why he couldn't just take two of his angels and be like, "You come along because I feel like it," right? I mean, what are they gonna say? No. So I mean, there's no reason why that couldn't be the case either. But anyway, besides the point, not particularly relevant. um, but basically, God approaches Abraham while Abraham's kind of hanging out in the day, and this is maybe how Abraham knew it was God that was approaching him. Because I mean, first of all, one of the tricky things about God approaching you is that basically God can take on any form, right? Because I mean, he's God; he can look like whatever he wants. So how Abraham would know this, right, um, is quite the mystery. Although one way of thinking about it is that like, well, they're in the heat of day. Most travelers don't do that because it's stupid, right? So only God would do that, right? Only God would walk around in the heat of day, right? Of course, God is also the guy to just walk around randomly in the middle of the night with no lights on, because he does that too. So he clearly, when you read through the Bible, God is kind of depicted as being pretty weird at times. He just does that because he can, right? So anyway, so it's the heat of the day, and God just approaches Abraham, right? And maybe because like he didn't see him in the distance or something, maybe he thought maybe God just appeared. You know, the Bible doesn't really say. It's a good explanation as any. So, God just appeared, if you will, and Abraham's like, oh, God's here now, because he does that. So, um, Abraham's first thing is to be hospitable. You want to be a good host of any visitors, right? And I mean, it's not like he does this only with God. He's Abraham's generally a nice guy in that regard, right? He he's hospitable, so that's a point in his favor. Um, and so he has he sets up a meal for these three guys, and they eat. Of course, the funny observation I wanted to point out is that he gets some milk curds and cheese, and then they also eat meat. So the reason why I kind of poke fun at that is because if you read in Leviticus, that ends up being forbidden for the Hebrew people. They're not supposed to eat, um, or at least it's interpreted that they're not supposed to eat meat and milk together. And it's crap. I can't think of the verse off the top of my head. Basically, what it says is you shall not cook a goat in its mother's milk. And basically, many Jewish people interpret that is that you can't have cheese and meat at the same time. Funny story actually about that. I didn't know this when I went to the Middle East a long time ago because I'm an idiot. And when I was there and I wondered, I was like, oh, breakfast, no meat. And it's like, why don't they have, there's no meat at breakfast? Because, Canada, we have like bacon in Canada for breakfast. It's like a common thing in Canada. We love our bacon in the morning. We're like that. Uh, no bacon. Well, I mean, there's the whole pig thing, but that's besides the point. So there's no meat for breakfast. But of course, it's mainly because coffee is a huge thing in like in Israel, the Middle East, love their coffee, and they love coffee and milk, right? They, you usually have milk with your coffee, um, unless you're one of those hardcore people, black only, right? um, but coffee all the time in the Middle East, especially in the morning. Gotta have coffee. Gotta have coffee. Everybody has coffee. You're weird if you don't drink coffee in the morning in Israel. You're weird. That's actually how much they drink coffee over there. Okay, so you're a weirdo if you don't drink coffee in the Middle East. And don't be one of those, I'm a tea alternative. No, you're a coffee drinker in the Middle East, or you're a freak. That's how it is. Anyway, milk with coffee, typical, right? So apparently, because of the whole way they interpret that passage, you can't, don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. You don't have milk and meat at the same time. But since everybody has coffee in the morning, which often has milk or cream, you can't have meat in the morning. Which is kind of the fun. That's kind of how they do things in the Middle East. Just a little bit of funny trivia. And I had to tell that story because I always remember it. Is like, yeah, we always have coffee because everybody will think you're weird if you don't drink coffee anymore. Of course, I mean, I was a college student at the time. I drink coffee all the time. I still drink it all the time now. You would think you think I would cut down on my coffee intake since I'm not a student anymore. But no, I drink a lot of coffee. I mean, obviously I drink less than I used to, but like back then, I was a college student, so like of course I drank coffee all the time. Of course I would have coffee, but you can't have, you know, you can't have your sausage McMuffin, okay, and coffee, right? This ain't Canada, so just a little funny thing. Um, well, that's part of Jewish culture, and it's also in general Middle Eastern, like the Arab world obviously does this too. Um, but I point this out because the funny thing is that in Genesis, well, one, Genesis didn't have the law yet, and it's kind of funny though, where some people may disagree that like Genesis was written after Leviticus. I'm more in the whole like, you know, God had Moses compile Genesis after the law, for reasons I've already stated. But of course, now we have this. But then, with that being said, we have this funny detail, and I wonder how many Jewish people went like, "Huh?" Right? When there's this scene where Abraham gives God, the guy who gave the law to Moses about not cooking a goat in its mother's milk, and here's Abraham just giving him, you know, venison and cheese, basically cordon bleu. And I wonder how many Hebrews went like, "Huh?" when they heard this part of the story, because it is one of those parts of the story that makes you like scratch your head, like. And this is where like I understand where people who are against Christianity would say, "See, God contradicts himself. He tells Jewish people not to have, you know, milk and meat together, and here's God, having milk and meat, right? What gives?" So understandable complaint. Um, because it is one of those funny moments, right? Like, why would God accept this? Of course, the other way of looking at it. Now, this is a much more Christianese way of looking at it. So, take this with a grain of salt. Um, this is just how, a Christian would answer this kind of contradiction would be like, well, it's because God is so forgiving that even if it did offend him at the time that Abraham did something this idiot. Well, one, it just shows Abraham is an idiot. That doesn't change, right? Just because God chooses you and decides to make a promise out of your life, that doesn't make you exempt from being an idiot. So there's that. Um, but so we can make fun of Abraham for being an idiot, and then God, maybe because God is so gracious, he's like, you know what? I'm gonna let this slide. Abraham's my homeboy, as we kind of were making jokes of in chapter 17. Abraham's my homeboy. All right, I'm not give him a hard time about this. Maybe that's how God went about it. Maybe, right? Maybe I'm not gonna claim I know the mind of God, but at the same time, maybe God was like, well, Abraham's kind of an idiot, but he's my homeboy, so I'm not gonna get mad about this. Maybe that's how God went about it. I don't know. I'm not saying that I'm not claiming that I do, but I think that could be one way it could have happened, right? But I mean, that would be God, God showing his forgiving nature, right? Which is, the core part of Christianity. So, um, that's my Christian approach to that, right? Would be that, well, God is so forgiving that even when Abraham, like, he F's up this badly by giving God milk and cheese. Or sorry, by giving him milk and meat. I don't know why I said milk and cheese. He gives him milk and meat. And God's like, you know what? I'm gonna let it slide, my homeboy. I'm gonna let it slide. Maybe that's how he went about it. Maybe that's why it's not a contradiction. Maybe Hebrew people knew that and didn't make a big deal out of it. Um, of course, that sounds weird because I pointed out a more Christian theme and figuring that Jews would know this, but that's besides the point. Ancient Hebrews, I shouldn't say Jews, I should say ancient Hebrews would know that. Because we're talking about in that context. We're not talking about modern readers. A modern reader approach would be that God is so forgiving that he lets it slide, right? After all, I mean, the rest of the chapter would actually kind of make that belief make sense, right? That God was super lenient with Abraham. Um, that even if this was considered an offense to God, God would have let it slide. Um, but I just wanted to point out, it's just kind of funny that, like, in the story, and it's a detail a lot of people never mention when they talk about this, is like, yeah, Abraham violates the law. He actually does something that God himself tells the Hebrew people not to do. And by extension, you could argue that Abraham did something really offensive to God by giving him milk and meat. I just think it's hilarious. I just think it's hilarious. But I'm one of those people who find things like that hilarious. So you might not find it hilarious, but I do. And that's good enough for me. I might as well skip the next part I was going to talk about just to keep talking about the whole milk and meat thing. So, the part where God is like super chill and forgiving of Abraham in his idiocy, because clearly Abraham's an idiot, right? So, I think that's kind of why it tells the Abraham feeding him this way first. It tells him this part of the story because I think it wants to tell you. I think you know Genesis 18 wants to tell you that Abraham is an idiot. And so when Abraham does something arguably pretty idiotic, and Abraham is well aware that what he's doing is idiotic. So it's not like, oh, it was a by chance Abraham's stupid. No, like Abraham knows he's being stupid here. Um, and that's the part where, the famous Abraham bargains with God, right? And everybody likes to point at the story as like, does God change his mind? Does he not change his mind? How come Abraham's able to bargain with him here, right? Because if God doesn't change his mind, then Abraham shouldn't be able to. But if God can change his mind, then that means the Christian belief that he's unchanging is not true. Like, what does this mean? But anyway, we get to this scene where Abraham bargains with God. Abraham's he admits he's an idiot. He knows he's an idiot, right? Because Abraham's like, well, I know I shouldn't really talk back to you about this. You did say we did just establish earlier that for 50 people, you spare the city. But I'm gonna can I make another request? Can you maybe let's say 45 people, right? And the guy's like, yeah, no problem. Oh, I know we just said 45, but can we bump it down to 40? What about 40 people, right? And Abraham's kind of like trying to bargain his way, but he doesn't want to. Like he's obviously embarrassed because he knows he's being an idiot at this point, right? Because I mean, Abraham knows who is he to tell God what to do. So I mean, Abraham's humble enough in that respect, right? Like he knows, okay, I can't really tell God what to do, but here he is telling God what to do, right? And so that's how Abraham is self-conscious enough that he knows he's being stupid. And I think the Bible obviously paints the story this way to kind of like show the contrast between Abraham and God, right? That God has his wisdom that transcends human beings because he's God and all that. And then here's Abraham just making a complete fool out of himself, right? Because he's an idiot, right? Like most guys are. Because Abraham is the reminder here, another thing too, contrast to chapter 17 where God makes like the big promise and everything. But despite that, once again, the theme is that it's not about it's not what humans can do. It's about what God can do, right? And so chapter 17 has this whole like Abraham really, or sorry, God really, how do I say it? How do I say it? God really, um, he measures up Abraham, right? Making him seem like, okay, Abraham, your life is going to be freaking awesome because I'm going to make it awesome. But at the same time, the reminder is that it's about what I can do, not you. And so chapter 18 kind of shows like, yeah, it's clearly about what God can do because Abraham's an idiot. So, and we can see it here, right? Abraham's being an idiot. And I think that's why this story is actually kind of funny, right? Where Abraham bargains with God. And I think that's the real point of the story, right? Is to show God's wisdom in contrast to Abraham not being very bright. But to be fair, I mean, Abraham is just like any other guy. The fact of the matter is, we're not as bright as we think we are. I mean, we all like to think we're pretty bright, but there are times where we just fail absolutely miserably. And here's Abraham's moment of failing quite miserably. Um, like a funny thing, I gotta kind of confess something. So I've been rewatching some South Park because the old stuff was really good. I used to really like the old stuff of South Park. Later stuff, not so much. But the other older stuff, I really love the older stuff of South Park. And the main reason is because Randy, I mean, it's true in some of the newer stuff, but you don't see it as often. But the parts of South Park I love is the stuff with Randy, Stan's dad, Randy Marsh. And Randy Marsh is like the best character for me. And the reason why I love Randy's character in South Park, I mean, he's a certain kind of narrative archetype. We call it the Holy Fool. And the Holy Fool is the character who, he's an idiot, but he, even though he's an idiot, but at the same time, he tries to do everything right. And he tries to do, good by his son Stan. He tries to be hip with the people, right? He tries to not sound like such an outsider. He tries not to be stuck in the old ways. He tries to, be understanding of the next generation, all that. But of course, the problem with Randy is that he fails every step of the way, right? That's why he's a fool, right? He's ambitious. He loves his son. He loves people, but he fails every step of the way, right? And I think what makes Randy such a great character, especially watching South Park as an adult, you watch how well, I mean, you shouldn't be watching it as a kid. It's not appropriate for kids. But when I rewatch it as an adult, okay, Missy, that's enough. Um, so when you rewatch it as an adult, you look at Randy and you just watch him fail miserably, and I just have those moments I look at him and I go, oh, I get it, I get it, because it's one of those things that when you're an adult, well, assuming you're not an asshole of an adult, sorry for the language, but if you're not an asshole of an adult, you understand, that I don't know as much as I think I do, and life is way more complicated than I think it is. And so when you see Randy fail and you can empathize with that, and you're like, I get it, I get it. And that's kind of like one of those things about how, well, reading Genesis is kind of supposed to be like that too, but that's what makes Abraham such an enjoyable character to read. I think is because he's a lot like, I mean, if you really think about it, Abraham is the original holy fool, right? He tries to do right by God, but he just sucks at it because, I mean, to be fair, he's like, at this point he's like 100 years old, so he's not a young chipper like he used to be, clearly. Um, but he Abraham just fails every step of the way in anything he does, right? And it's just kind of one of those things, just kind of funny to see. And so the hospitality scene is the contrast with um, the scene of him bargaining with God, right? Because he really wants to do right. Because I mean, the main reason um, that Abraham wants to save Sodom is because his nephew lives there, and Abraham is more than well aware of this. After all, Abraham had to save Lot like 3 4 chapters ago, um, and then when Sodom got taken over by those kings with funny names, and so Abraham is really thinking he wants to do right by Lot, right? He wants to save his nephew, right? But here he is just failing every step of the way, right? And God obviously knows this, and God's kind of screwing with him here. I mean, let's be honest, that's basically what he's doing. I know some people will be like, well, God doesn't do that. It's like, of course he does. He does it all the time. He does it in every single person's life to an extent. I know that's a heretical thought. You probably think it's heretical, but the Bible says that he does it more than once, and he does it with like a lot of people. So there's no reason to say he doesn't do it now. That would be a heretical statement. Would be saying that God would have changed from his nature in the Bible. There's your real heretical statement, people. Um, so I don't think my thought is heretical. That God is clearly screwing around with Abraham, just like he does with a lot of other people. Uh, that would be consistent with his whole not changing thing, as opposed to him changing his mind here with the whole numbers thing. But once again, it's not so much about God changing his mind about the number. It's more that God is consistent, that he likes screwing around with people, even people that he made covenants with, because he does that. And I mean, who are you to tell God how he does things? Because that's a hilarious thing I would love to see, because I'm a sadist like that. um, but once again, the contrast of, or sorry, the two ends of chapter 18, and I think that's how the Bible translator, or the modern Bible, yeah, modern translators would have divided up the chapters. Chapter 18 kind of has the contrast of like Abraham, idiotic in the beginning, Abraham really idiotic at the end, and the middle part is his wife being idiotic. So really, chapter 18 is just full of human idiocy. But I mean, honestly, I'm surprised we haven't seen that in a while, because chapter 17 had none of that, right? Well, no, that's not true. Chapter 17 did have Sarai. Oh no, sorry. Chapter 16 had Sarai being an idiot. Um, Chapter 17 had no human idiocy. So basically, chapter 18 is like we're back to the program, right? Chapter 17 is like the commercial break of like dealing with God dealing with human beings and how stupid they can be. And so I think that's kind of the funny thing here, and that's the thing I wanted to point out, is kind of like the reason why the chapter 18 does what it does. Um, is once again just to remind us that it's not about the human beings, right? It's about what God can do and how good God is. Because human beings are pretty terrible, especially when you got to deal with this moronic couple, right? For lack of better words. And I know some people would be like, what? You're calling Abraham and Sarai stupid people? Yeah, they're stupid people, just like everyone else. So they're not exceptions to the case, okay? If anything, you'd be worried that they weren't stupid people, right? Because then they're not human, right? And the whole point of Genesis is to talk, a big part of Genesis, rather, is about the human condition and how really shamelessly stupid that we are, more often than not. So, uh, yeah, I just wanted to point that out, and I think it's actually it adds humor to the Bible for starters. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with painting Abraham and Sarah as kind of being dumb people in this chapter. It adds a lot of humor to it, and I think that's the whole reason why Isaac's name is so appropriate. And Isaac is probably the first character that's not named ironically in the story. Because remember, well, no, that's not true. Adam and Eve were pretty unironic names. But like Cain and Abel, ironic, right? Abram, ironic. Sarai, ironic. Abraham, ironic. Sarah, ironic. Right? All their names are ironic. Um, and then Isaac is the one who doesn't, God gives him this name and it's not ironic, right? Well, Ishmael also has a pretty normal name. It's not meant to be like used in an ironic way. But I mean, Ishmael is not a major character. Like I said, Ishmael is just a product of circumstance. So his name fits accordingly. um, but, I think that's why the Isaac thing is so funny, right? And you realize, Isaac's name means like laughter, or I laughed. Um, and God says, that's what you're going to name him. Because, you laughed in your hearts about me. and now everyone's gonna laugh at you about it. So Isaac's name is so appropriate. Um, and I think that's one of the great things about chapter 18. It's just this kind of back to the program of just dealing with how silly Abraham and Sarah can be. Speaking of Sarah being really silly, there's the middle part of the chapter, right? So, you know, uh, God's like, "Yo, where's your wife?" And then Abraham's like, "Oh, she's in the tent." It's funny how God has to ask him that, right? But maybe he doesn't do it because he doesn't know, right? God asks him that to have conversation with the guy, right? You don't just, when you're talking to your homeboy, right? You're gonna have regular dialogue. You're not gonna like act weird and come up with random ass nonsensical topics. Like God has some social skills. So after all, remember the Bible is telling us that humans are the ones that are comical, not God, right? In their thinking. God is the one with common sense. So God brings up regular conversation. So that's another thing too that a lot of people tend to think is like kind of weird about the Bible, where God asks rhetorical questions, but He doesn't ask it because He doesn't know. He asks it because He's, for lack of better words, God is behaving in a human way. Like you're hanging out with your buddy, if you're hanging out with your buddy, you're gonna ask him how his wife is, right? Assuming he's married, right? You're gonna ask your buddy how their spouses are, right? You're not gonna act weird and just dive into some other conversation, right? Like imagine if like, you know, God and his two buddies, or the Trinity, whichever way you want to look at it. They're eating, and then Abraham just brings up, yo, I feel like blowing up Sodom and Gomorrah, and just brought that up at the table. That would have been awkward. Right? Like, that would be awkward, right? He just brings up the topic. Yeah, we're gonna blow up Sodom and Gomorrah. You want to come watch? Right? Like that's not how he starts the conversation, right? He starts it with something pretty regular. Just says, "Yo, how's your wife? Where's your wife at?" Um, and then Abraham's like, "Well, she's just over there." And then, God continues the conversation. Yo, remember that thing I told you the other day? About having a kid and stuff. Yeah, I just gonna tell you about that again. This time next year, you guys can have a kid. Just regular conversation. After he brings up, "How's your wife?" You guys working on that kid project I told you about? Um, and of course, the funny thing is, like, Sarai thinks is hilarious, which is like, "I'm old. It's not like I'm ever gonna have sex again," which is what that thing is a euphemism of, by the way. Because the Bible does that a lot, right? I mean, for storytelling purposes, you don't just like throw sex bomb, like just randomly in the story. It kind of changes the mood of the story, but you also want to leave people to their funny imaginations, because humans do that, right? We imagine things and we snicker like high school children. Um, like we snicker like 13-year-olds. Um, when it's like, "Ooh, they thought it was sex," but the Bible obviously uses euphemisms to kind of like, storytelling purposes, right? Because you don't just say, imagine how boring the scene, like if you were telling this story and there's like, and Sarai thought, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I'm never having sex again." Like that kind of throws the mood off the narratives, right? But obviously that's what she meant when she said like, "Will I ever know that pleasure again?" Um, and the Bible does this a lot, right? It kind of uses these sexual euphemisms, because you don't just throw the word sex out there like that. Um, but I think it's kind of funny where Sarah's just like, of course, half of her snickering to herself is legitimized, because, she is old and thinks, rightfully so, that she's never having sex again. I mean, that's the whole reason why she gave the slave in the first place. Was like, yeah, it's not happening, guys. Not happening. And it's one of those funny things that no one ever really, I mean, no one really wants to think about it, because no one wants to think about two old people getting it on. But, it's one of those funny things, and the Bible kind of like brings up, like, yeah, Abraham and Sarah have to make Isaac the normal way, right? Because one of the funny implications that the Bible does as well, where it's like, there's a reason why every time they talk about Jesus' birth, they always go out of their way to say the virgin birth, right? Well, there's two reasons, right? One is the prophetic nature. that it makes Jesus different from every other kid, and two, um, because it well one it, well actually it goes back to reason number one is that it makes him different from everyone else, right? That's the whole reason why when it talks about Jesus' birth, um, it's always brought up as the virgin birth, right? Because it really wants to distinguish him from every other kid. But with that being said, distinguishing him from every other kid, you read in the Bible and there's all these other funny stories about people having kids, and there's never a mention of virgin birth, which the assumption means that they're all born the normal way, the birds and the bees, which is funny to think about, especially when the Bible paints the circumstances, old ass people, polygamy, in the case of like Jacob later, you know, old people again with like Zachariah and Elizabeth, and then of course like um, what's his face, the guy. Well, Hannah is the woman we remember, but Hannah with her eating disorder, gotta do things the normal way. um, and none of these guys get like an off out, even though it's like really, we're not people fit. We're not people who are fit to do this. For the birds and the bees. You know what I'm saying? But God's like, no, you're doing it the normal way. I made it for a reason. I don't know, maybe, but um, this is one of those funny things where like that's why Sarah's laughing here, right? She thinks it's ridiculous. She's like, well, I'm never gonna have sex again. What makes you think we're gonna have a kid next year, right? And Abraham even pointed out in the last chapter is like, dude, I'm 100 years old. My wife is 90. No way this is gonna work. And God's like, it's gonna work, and I'm gonna make you make it work. And so it's just one of those funny things. And so, I mean, Sarah is not so much of an idiot as opposed to Abraham with the whole meat and milk thing. But when Sarah kind of doubts God, it's kind of meant to kind of paint her as an idiotic character. Though in her defense, her reasoning as opposed to Abraham, like Abraham just does it because he's a guy and he doesn't think things through. Whereas like I guess the contrast with Abraham and his wife is that Abraham doesn't think and Abraham overthink. Or sorry, Abraham doesn't think, Sarai or Sarah overthinks, right? Sarah overthinks, and that's why she doubts. She doubts, oh, God's promise can't happen because I'm an old fart that's never having sex again. And Abraham's just he has no thought process, right? So um, I guess there's another little mini contrast in the narrative there too, right, between Abraham and his wife. Um, how they both act really stupid in their own different ways. And it's true with and it's kind of interesting that they show this spectrum, right, of the guy who doesn't think and the woman that overthinks, which is, well, one, it's a stereotype of how men and women act, right? Like men are stupid because we don't think, right? And it's always a guy who's always pointed out for thinking without, or sorry, with speaking without thinking, right? That's the whole fault of men. We always speak without thinking, right? Completely unfiltered. Um, and then like women always jump to crazy conclusions because they overthink, right? Woman, you're thinking too much, right? That's always the complaint men have towards their wives. Woman, you think too much. You're overthinking things, right? And so, the Bible is kind of just painting this archetype, with this couple, right? And they both make, and it makes them both look silly for different reasons. So it's just kind of more biblical humor in that sense, and really pointing out a lot about human beings and how we act, right? Because you thought I wasn't going to talk about that again today. Guess what? I'm talking about it today. So fundamental parts of human beings and the way that we act, right? The human condition, right? That we just sure we do a lot of dumb things, but I mean, it's just part of being human, right? And God is so relaxed about it. He doesn't get mad about it. Like, sure, he points out Sarah for like, why'd you laugh at me? What, you think what I'm saying is a joke, right? Like, I'm dead serious about this, right? And of course, once again, this shows God's consistency and His goodness. Well, some people may disagree of goodness, the way that I'm using it, but God's consistency and goodness, in contrast to, the fickle, immature, and idiotic in Abraham's case, behavior, right? The contrast between God and human beings. And this in chapter 18 it's very rich in that. And it's interesting to think about how the Bible writer was able to encapsulate all of that in these short scenes. Um, you know, God eating at Abraham's tent, and then God talking about blowing up Sodom, right? And then of course, um, Abraham, just to end the chapter, Abraham and God walk around for a little bit, and then they have a little dialogue. And it's kind of funny how God asks the two guys, which is where, like, once again, the more Christian idea makes sense of like the Trinity, because he actually has to ask them, like, should I tell Abraham about this, about what I'm gonna do? Because if they were just angel escorts, he wouldn't need to ask them. He'd be like, whatever, I'm gonna do what I want, right? And so, um, but the Lord, um, he actually deliberates with the other two. And this is where actually, here's my super hot take of the week if you want it. Um, and this is where, once again, there's that weird funky blur with like how the Trinity works. And I'm going to bring it up again because some people have the misconception that, like, well, the Old Testament was just the Father and the New Testament, is Jesus and the Holy Spirit. It's actually completely false. Because in this scene, when it's the Lord, clearly it's the person of Jesus that's acting here. And this is where one of those things that, like, when people try to differentiate how each part of the Trinity functions, if you will, in the role of God. So think of like God as the role, and then the personas are the how God presents himself. And so many people would say that, like, Jesus is obviously the doer, right? And then the Spirit acts as the voice and the teacher, right? He's the teaching voice. As Jesus himself says, I will give you the helper that will remind you everything I said and continue to teach you. And then, of course, there was the whole question of what the heck does the Father do then? If the Spirit does all the talking and Jesus does all the doing, what the heck does the Father do? And then, of course, the popular answer, well, it's not a popular answer, it is the answer of what the Father does as far as the Trinity is concerned, is that the Father is the will, right? He decides what's going to go down. That's why Jesus himself says, when it comes to the end, only the Father knows, because when the Father wills it, that's when it is, right? And so, and of course, like, Jesus always talks about doing his Father's will, right? So the Father, his main purpose is the will, right? And so, why do I bring this up? Well, when you read this part when the Lord deliberates with the other two, and then he decides he's going to tell Abraham, the interesting thing, and my hot take, if you will, and once again debunking that myth that a lot of people, when they read the Bible, they say, well, the Old Testament is just the Father, and then, like, the New Testament is Jesus and the Holy Spirit. This is not true. Especially when Christians say this, I really got to correct you guys on this. But clearly, as you can see in this scene, Abraham talks to Jesus. This is Jesus he's talking to, or the Son, right? Because it's the doer. He's the doer. And he says, all right. And then he's the one that actually has a conversation with Abraham. And so, he's the Lord here is the one that actually has the real conversation, right? Of course, some people may think that this is not, I may be contradicting myself later, because in chapter 19, obviously, the Son isn't there. The other two show up in the town, which is a very different implication of its own, which I will obviously cover when I read chapter 19. But the person Abraham talks to in chapter 18 is actually the Son and not the Father, contrary to popular belief, because of course many people think it's the Father he's talking to, one, because everyone thinks everything in the Old Testament is the Father. Not necessarily true. And then, of course, the way that they communicate. And this is where, once again, a lot of Christians, myself included, we would say that, like, well, we can say that the angel of the Lord is also like the Son slash Jesus, is because they don't just say the same things. Like Jesus will say the same things as some of these figures, and this is one example, right, in chapter 18, where he's this the Lord here, he says stuff only Jesus would say, or when Christians make the argument that Jesus is God, or the deity of Jesus, is because Jesus would only say the kind of stuff that he says here, right? And so, um, when the Lord is deliberating with the other two, he's saying stuff that Jesus himself would say, right? I've chosen him. He'll direct his children. Blah 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 blah. And then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sins is grievous. I will go down and see what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And so when that's an interesting part, right? Because it's one of those funny things where, once again, why does the Bible do things like God will say things that sound really rhetorical, especially for God to say, right? It's one thing for a human being to be like, yeah, I'm going to go check this place out and see what I heard is true. It's another thing for God to say, I'm going to go down to this place and check out, what I've heard is true. But, I mean, if he's God, then he doesn't need to. He already knows. But it's stuff that Jesus always does, right? He always says, I will know. I will, you know, I will see and then I will know. And then Jesus uses this in reverse as well, see me and know me, right? And so this kind of language is language Jesus uses. Or rather, when a lot of Christian apologists argue for the deity of Christ, they would say, well, Jesus says this kind of stuff that only God would say in the Old Testament. And so, once again, I mean, I know I'm kind of like really pulling at the Trinity doctrine a little bit, because it's one of those things that's like, well, it's not easy to explain. I mean, people have been trying to explain the Trinity doctrine for like centuries. And I mean, well, when we're talking about God, can you fully exhaust it? But at the same time, it is like, it's very complex and it has all these nuances in it. And so chapter 18 shows another one of these nuances. Just one of many, honestly. Um, if you wanted to pick at every nuance, we'd be at this for like, I could make a I could make a 24-hour stream out of picking out nuances between the spirit, or the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, and then like Jesus in the New Testament. I could make a 24-hour stream. Don't challenge me on that though. But at the same time, I'm saying it so that you can challenge me. So, I mean, if you want me to do it, I mean, you got to put some incentive in it, obviously. I'm not just going to do it because you say so. But, if there was enough reason for me to do it, I could actually do a 24-hour stream. Because there is that much material. There is that much material on how, like, the angel of the Lord and the Lord in the old, the person who's specifically called the Lord in the Old Testament is actually this not exactly the same as Jesus, and the argument of how Jesus, the deity of Jesus, that many Christians make is because he does things that only God would do, right? And I mean, he also says things that only God would say, right? And I mean, I know I'm jumping to the New Testament for a bit, but that's exactly why he was executed, right? By the Jewish authorities, is because Jesus kept doing that. He kept saying that kind of stuff, and the Jews weren't stupid, right? I mean, I would say that the Christians who missed that point are the stupid people, but the ancient Jews weren't stupid. They knew exactly what Jesus was talking about, and that was blasphemy to them, right? So that's why they killed him. So that's why they wanted him dead. So but here's chapter 8. What I'm trying to get at, chapter 18 has one such case, right? And so, oh, but why would Jesus destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? He's supposed to be all loving. Well, sometimes it's got to get serious. And with that being said, we're going to move on to chapter 19, because we're going to talk about blowing up that place now. Because God's about to get serious. It's business time. Which I use that with all kinds of nuances, which I will bring up again. So Pay attention. Chapter 19. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." But Lot insisted so strongly that they ended up going with him and entered his house. Lot prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came with you tonight? Bring them out so we can have sex with them." Oh, the Bible actually just says it that way. After the whole point I made in chapter 18 that Sarah did not say it that way. But I think there's a contrast, and I'll cover that later. Bring them out so we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have two daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under protection of my roof." Dad of the year right here. "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door. The two men then said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters. And Lot said, "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you'll be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and his two daughters, and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Run for your lives, and do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. But I can't run for the mountains. This disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to. It is small. Let me flee to it, for it is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." Then the angel said, "Very well. I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of. But flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." So by the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah. Sorry, he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Now Lot and his two daughters, verse 30. Lot and his two daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his two daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink, and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." Sounds like a terrible plan. That night they got their father to drink wine, and the older went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day the older said to the younger, "Last night I slept with our father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." You really can't think this plan's gonna work twice. So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Go figure. And again he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. Go figure. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she called him Ben-Ami, 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 and he is the father of the Ammonites of today. Just gotta check something here. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, okay. No, that works. Because Abraham's arc will be the next four. The end of Abraham's arc will be the next 4 chapters. But it's kind of funny how like in the middle there was like that huge interruption with like Lot. I guess there's some fable elements in it. Let me just turn back to it for a second. There you go. We're talking about chapter 19, and then we're gonna end the stream. But chapter 19 has the famous Sodom and Gomorrah story, where God decides to rain fire from the sky and blow up the cities. He went to go blow them up because he was like, you know what? These people are so wicked, and I'm gonna go blow up the town now. And the funny thing is that, like, similar to Noah, there's this whole claim of like Lot being relatively righteous, but honestly, he's a pretty terrible human being and kind of a really crappy dad. Like, real Father of the Year material right here. So, anyway, let's start with the beginning of the story. So basically, the 2 angels that were with the Lord earlier, they go down to Sodom, and Lot. What he's doing at the gate is beyond me. Is he like? Is that his job, or, you know, like as the gatekeeper, security, or something? Um, it's not totally clear. He's just kind of at the gate. And he sees the 2 angels, and it's funny how like Lot and Abraham know, who these guys are. I mean, maybe like God just revealed to them. God gave them magic sight in that moment. Who knows? But they know, right? In this case, Lot knows who he's dealing with here, and so he's like, "Oh, my lords, stay at my house," kind of thing, right? And it's funny how the angels are like, "Nah, we're just gonna chill out here in the city square. We're gonna act like homeless guys, just sleep in the city square." And Lot's like, "That's a terrible idea." So he basically like sends him to his house, right? And of course, while they're there, this is where like there's that whole thing about like what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and was it the whole like being gay thing? Um, I think, I mean, that's part of it because it's more like of the product, if you will. Like, let's put it this way: when other parts of the Bible, it talks about how like they oppress other people. They're pretty mean. They don't feed the poor. They they're violent toward each other and whatever. The fact that these men were going to gang rape. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that word on camera exactly. They're going to they're gonna go for the grape, and that kind of was more like of a product of how rotten these people were, right? Because it's that old saying, how do I put it? It's not an old saying. I'm trying to think of a way of expressing this idea, but like think of it similar to like, here's a bad example, but it's the best one I can think of, like a drug addiction, right? Where if you have a drug addiction, right, your whole purpose in your drug addiction is just to get the next high, right? But of course, as how drugs work and how the human brain works, every time you try to take your drug, you need more of it to get the high, right? Because your body gets habituated to the drug. And so eventually you do more awful things to get your high, right? So, you don't think of like, you think of the average person who is like addicted, like your average addict, if you will. And, they didn't start out being, full fledged, like, criminals who constantly shoplift or steal. They're not constantly committing violence. They didn't start out that way, but at least for the most part, they didn't. But what leads them to that kind of life? What eventually causes the downward spirals? Because if the high is so important, right, then you will say, well, then screw these other things. They're not as important. What's important is the high. So I don't care who has to get hurt in the way. I don't care if I have to break these other things, because the law is less important than my high, right? That's kind of the logic of an addict. That's why like later they have no problem with stealing. They have no problem with vandalism. They have no problem because the law is less important than the high. Ethics is less important than the high. No human being is as important as the high, right? That's why they have no problem trying to take your money, right? And even if they're trying to be polite, like begging for your money, it's a way of dehumanizing you, right? Because all you are is a means for more drugs. The reason why I'm so passionate about pointing that out is because that's my frustration. Where, on the one hand, we want to be nice to people who are like, we want to be able to help people who are down on their luck, kind of thing. But there's one thing between like, you know, um, helping, say, my cousin who got screwed over by the pandemic because he can't work. Um, well, actually, recently he found a job, but like for a while, I was helping out my cousin, and he got like majorly boned by the pandemic because he worked in a restaurant, and if you can, restaurants were all shut down, so he was basically out of a job. So it really sucked for him, and we had to, my family, we kind of helped him out a little bit financially because he wanted to do like, he had this whole plan, right? He had um, his son was born in Japan, and of course his wife, well, it's because his wife is from there, and well, that was the reason why I went in December, was to go see the baby and all that when when they had the baby and all that, right? And my cousin had this huge plan, and he had it all thought in his head. It was a good plan, right? Get this apartment and then have it ready for when his wife moved over, and then the two of them were gonna, build their lives here for a few years before going back to Japan to raise their son when he was older and stuff like that. And my cousin had this huge plan, right? And he had the financial planned out too, right? With him working this, his restaurant job, and his wife was gonna go back to this manager job that she had, and it was gonna be a great plan. But then the whole pandemic hit, and it basically just boned him, right? Neither of them could go back to work because the manager job was also like restaurant related, and then my cousin worked in a restaurant, so got totally boned, right? I don't know where I was going with this, but oh yeah, talk about the job thing. So that's it's one thing for like, okay, the pandemic totally screwed my cousin over. So it's one thing for me to like, you know, give alms to him and help him out financially, right? Because in that case, I still work during the pandemic because my job counted as an essential. Um, well, the way that it works is because the places I did security work for were considered essential, and therefore my job was considered essential. Because if you have to guard a place that's considered essential, you're then by extension considered an essential. So um, I was an essential, so I was still making money, um, and I was still working. So helping out my cousin's one thing in that regard because he got boned by the pandemic. But it's another thing where, okay, there's the guy who's always begging, right, at the same place, and you know, people know this guy does drugs. Like he looks high half the time, and he's begging for money. And some people actually give him money. Some people actually buy him meals. But I always try and discourage people when I actually get the chance to talk to them, and some people actually take it the wrong way because I hate to say it, but people are pretty stupid. Um, because people don't quite get it, right? It's like if you buy a meal for a person who does drugs, you're essentially enabling them to keep doing drugs. And it's actually worse than that, because see, the way you have to look at it is you may think you're doing something nice, right? You may think that, oh, I'm being nice, I'm being generous by giving this guy, food because he's hungry. And sure, that may make you feel good. And most of the time that is a good thing when you feed someone that's hungry. It makes you feel good, and that in itself, it's not entirely a bad thing. But I think what a lot of people tend to forget is you have to look at the other side, right? And really, what's really happening, right? Because what you think and what you believe is only one side of the story, right? But when you look at both sides and you really see what's going on, right, is you're enabling someone to use you, and that's really what your actions allow, right? So you feed a guy, and the guy's clearly like he's homeless because he's an addict. What you're doing is you're enabling him, and really you have dehumanized yourself because what is the other guy thinking? He's not thinking, "Oh, you're such a nice guy for giving me food." That's not what he thinks. What he thinks is, "Awesome. I'm gonna be able to survive long enough to maybe get money off other people to get my next fix." All you are is a means for more drugs, right? And so that was some. I mean, I know it sounds super mean for me to say it this way, but like, you know, that's why you're stupid, right? Is because you allow people to think that of you. Like, it's ironic. This is where I laugh at the hilarity of it. Where like, we talk about like, oh, we're all people, and we should all be treated as human beings, and yet you willingly dehumanize yourself, right? You willingly dehumanize yourself to allow yourself to be what in people's minds means for drugs. That's all you are when you do that, right? It's similar to like an extreme, and it's ironic that we fight this problem, but we don't fight the homeless problem because we think the opposite is true. Like you think, oh, they can keep being homeless and we'll just take care of them. It's like, no, you're dehumanizing everyone. Your taxpayers. You're dehumanizing working people. You're basically treating like basically when you think that like, oh, just you think it's harmless by giving a guy some food, free food or whatever, but it's like you really dehumanize everyone who had to put effort into how our society works, right? I mean, farmers, they're not people, right? Builders, they're not people, right? You completely disregard all those people and all the effort they put in, right? Because F them, right? That's what you think. They're not real people. The people is who I consider people. Well, myself, I'm the only real person. And oh, I feel whatever makes me feel good, those people are what I consider people, right? So feeding a homeless guy, well, that guy's a person. But, you know, when that guy has to go steal from someone else, or that guy is going to be a pain in someone else's ass later, all those guys aren't people, right? Which is an extremely narcissistic way of thinking, which is why you shouldn't think that way. Um, but uh, it's so dehumanizing. And you know, it's funny how people think that's okay, but then of course we still fight against human trafficking and porn, right? Because unless you're a crazy person, you know, or as you know, a true narcissist, you know, we would all acknowledge that porn is extremely dehumanizing, right? The whole point of it is dehumanizing women to be sexual objects, right? That's the whole point of it. And so, um, you know, and we have no problem. Most people have no problem talking about how like, well, porn is super dehumanizing, but at the same time, you know, we allow things like, you know, to let go of like, oh, you know, homeless guy over here and not feeding him. But then when you do feed him, give him free food rather, um, you dehumanize yourself, which is, you know, almost as much of a crime. Of course, like porn is kind of more extreme, and there's other implications in it that are extremely bad, which is why it's art. You know, it is fair to view that as worse. That is true, but at the same time, and where I was going with the Sodom and Gomorrah story with this was because like, you know, when you have habituated dehumanizing other people, right? You know, abusing abusing the poor, abusing other citizens, being violent to one another, you know, as other translations of the Bible, I was actually kind of funny when I pointed out that like the NIV decided not to censor it. Um, in other versions of the Bible where they do censor the part where the guys are like, "Hey, we're gonna have sex with the two guests that you have," um, the censored version was, "Let us make sport of them," making sport, something like that. It's like, let us make sport of them, which was a euphemism of well the grape, and so the sin of Gomorrah was because they had become so desensitized to human. This is where I was going with it. Desensitizing, you know, how much they dehumanize other people, right? And so two random strangers, well, doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter where they come from. We're gonna make sport of them, right? As the euphemism goes, and it just shows how far they have dehumanized people, which is, you know, and the fact that you know it's men, you know, doing the grape with other men. It's not the fact that it's men and men. It's not man sex that's the issue, right? In this case, it's the sense of the great amount of dehumanizing that leads these guys to think what they think, right? That's the big sin here is the amount of dehumanization. Because once again, you know, the earlier chapters, and I was kind of having fun with it, talking about it earlier, about how, you know, how God acts very human, right? And God acts human in being playful. And of course, it makes sense for God to do this with Abraham because, you know, Abraham is as human gets, right? Which is why he's kind of this like archetype character because he's as human gets. He's a dude bro. He's a typical dude bro, right? And God is having, you know, God's hanging out with this dude bro, and they're just having a grand old time, right? And they act, and the contrast is that God is he acts very human because he's one way of wording is that he's legitimizing the humanity in Abraham, flaws and all, right? He legitimizes God legitimizes Abraham's humanity, flaws and all, right? Yes, sin is a problem in the world, that's true. But at the same time, that doesn't mean God will dehumanize you because you have sin, right? For the most part. Well, when he brings punishment, it's not because he's dehumanizing them. It's because, you know, it's the whole eye for an eye thing, and there's a reason why that law exists the way it does, which I will get to in a second. But basically, the contrast is that God humanizes himself to elevate, that's the word I was thinking of, to elevate the humanity in Abraham, if that makes sense, right? So God acts more human to elevate the humanity of Abraham and Sarah by extension, and really other, you know, Hagar and Ishmael, as far as the chapters we've covered, right? So God he elevates their humanity by acting way more human than we expect him to, right? Because once again, you know, God is supposedly transcendent. He's, you know, he he's not human because he's God, right? But at the same time, he acts so human because he's elevating the humanity in Abraham, Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael. He elevates their humanity by acting human himself. And so for God, this is a good thing, right? This is the beauty of life. And that's another reason why God can kind of have this playful attitude with Abraham. They're having a grand old time because of, you know, the the love he's showing for Abraham in elevating his humanity, flaws and all, right? God elevates his humanity. And so the reason why he's so mad and is willing to commit this kind of punishment onto Sodom and Gomorrah is because Sodom and Gomorrah does the complete opposite, right? It's this incredible level of dehumanizing people that God cannot have. He cannot have that, right? Because remember, you know, a constant theme in Genesis is that humans are made in the image of God, which is why they have such a high value. And that's why, even when we have sin in our lives, God still wants to elevate parts of our humanity. He wants to cleanse us of the sin so that that humanity can be, elevated even more, right? Because the humanity in us is what God, he loves that. That's why he keeps us around, right? And to be fair, he did make that was made in his image, right? And so there is a perfect level. We will never get there in this life, but that perfect level just shows that you know but even though we won't reach that perfect level in this life, God still elevates the humanity that we do have, right? And so the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, where a lot of people go, well, what was the real crime of Sodom and Gomorrah? Was ultimately that dehumanizing of other human beings. And so that's why he punishes. That's why he punishes Sodom and Gomorrah, is because they have gone so far to dehumanize other people. And so, in the whole all the men in the city want to do the grape, um, is just kind of like one example, but really it's supposedly from a long string of, because you don't start there, right? You don't start with the whole grape. You start with bits at a time, but the Bible doesn't tell us what those bits are, and that doesn't even matter. What you see is that, well, we've already gone so far that these people would obviously refuse to repent if they were given that option, because they've already gone so far in their dehumanizing of others, if you will. And so um, that's kind of the big thing in the Sodom and Gomorrah story that needs to be understood, is that God has this. That's why God, and I kind of refer to this, but the whole eye for an eye thing, that's why that law exists, right? You don't take human life, because God holds human life to this high value, and so it's kind of this weird the weird logic. It's not, well, really, it's not that weird, but as moderns, we try to not really focus on it, if that makes sense. But the logic that kind of works here is that if you commit murder, which is one of the few major sins that actually has the death penalty, right? You stone them, according to the Old Testament, is because the logic is, in order to murder somebody, you've already dehumanized them enough that you can feel like there's not a problem with just killing them. An innocent person, right? A person who does not deserve to just get killed. Well, really, nobody does, right? But if you commit murder, you've obviously passed the psychological part of, you know, dehumanizing someone to the point that it was okay for you to do it. That you've somehow rationalized, yeah, it's totally okay for me to kill this guy, right? And so basically how the Bible, when it made that law, you stone murderers, was because, well, if you already went through that mental process, don't expect other people to do it for you, right? So if, for example, if I was like, well, whatever, I don't value human life, I just kill whoever I want. then why should you spare? Why should you give me mercy, right? It's the scene that comes to mind, and I'm not gonna play it. Go look it up yourself because I don't want to get copyright struck or anything. Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball Z. Wow, the Canadian really came out there. In Dragon Ball Z, um, there's that scene. There's this great scene. Everyone makes a meme out of the fight scene itself, but there's a moment in the scene, and it's Goku versus Frieza. And after Frieza cuts himself like in half because he he hits himself with his own Destructo disc. Um, and then Goku's about to leave, right? Because Frieza's basically now like lying there in like three pieces now, and Goku's about to walk off, and Frieza's like, trying to utter his breath, spare me, right? Like help me. And then Goku gets really mad because I mean he's already super mad. That's why he went Super Saiyan in the first place. But then Goku gets even more mad here, and he goes, "Why should I spare you? Why should I give you the same mercy you decided not to give to anyone else?" And then, of course, Goku contradicts himself. He gives him a little bit of his energy, and Goku says, "I gave you a bit of my energy. Now go," right? And then Goku tries to leave, and then Frieza decides to spit on the mercy and tries to go one last ditch effort to kill him, but fails miserably because Frieza's an idiot. But that's besides the point. And Frieza is supposedly so evil he doesn't learn, right? But I mean, that's the reason why Frieza is so evil, right? He has no regard for humanity, loosely using when you're talking about aliens, but Frieza has zero regard for humanity, and so in the same way, Sodom and Gomorrah kind of represent that, right? You could, your meme for the day, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible, Frieza, right? So Frieza's in the Bible, guys, as Sodom and Gomorrah. That can be your meme for today. Um, but basically, um, that's the reason why God has no problem punishing Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Even though like, oh, God is all loving, but He's also just, and so things like dehumanizing people cannot go unchecked, right? And before people get too critical on God, like, oh, God judges these people or dehumanizes, like, well, to be fair, not even like, how do I put that? As human beings, that's how we should feel, right? And I mean, controversial time. Wow, I'm just hitting all the marks today. Um, that's the reason why Black Lives Matter is such a thing, right? We can't stand people dehumanizing others, right? We can't stand it, and that's, you know, the Christian worldview is that that's something we all inherited from God, right? That's why we can't stand, you know, the way certain the way the justice system's currently set up, because it still has those little cracks where people get dehumanized in them, right? That's why there's all those campaigning to fight against, like to end human trafficking. Of course, we want to end human trafficking. We can't stand people who willingly dehumanize other people, right? We can't stand it, right? Any sensible human being can't stand that, right? And that's why that's why protests are made. That's why we fight against all these kind of institutions that allow for, dehumanizing of people, right? That's why people make protests and like Black Lives Matter. That's why those things exist, right? It's because we can't stand when people are dehumanized, and so of course this is where like you obviously have to watch yourself when you try and have your fury, right? Because the Bible also warns about going too far, right? There's the whole thing about how to be wary of the Avenger, right? The Avenger were people who were basically vigilantes in the Bible, and they were like, well, that guy committed murder, so we're gonna go kill him. But it's like, hold on, we gotta have a trial. We gotta do this. We gotta do this right. And the Avengers would be like, well, no, that doesn't matter. Like we know this guy did it. What? Why do we have to wait for a court, right? I mean, that's going a little too far to disregard things like due process. But at the same time, going back to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, because I know I immediately jumped to Leviticus there for a second, but um, I mean, honestly, you can't talk about Genesis without talking about Leviticus, um, because so much of Genesis is an allegorical story to relate to Leviticus. But besides the point. And that's its own lecture altogether, um, or own series of lectures altogether. Um, but when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah's crime and their sin against God was, the dehumanizing of others, and that is a very serious crime in God's eyes, right? It's punishable by death, and so this is why adultery technically counts as a form of dehumanizing, right? Because you have to dehumanize the people you trust, right? Or sorry, not people you trust, people who trust you, right? Which is a massive insult, right? That's why betrayal is such a massive sin, and according to Dante, is the worst sin, right? Dante, not a biblical source, but a brilliant medieval writer. Um, Dante thought betrayal was the worst because, once again, that dehumanizing of others to that degree, right? To disregard someone's humanity so much that you would betray all trust, like that's extremely dehumanizing. Taking a life is extremely dehumanizing, right? Because you've disregarded the humanity of another person in order to commit murder, right? Of course, like warfare is a gray area, right? Because sometimes it's like, well, I have to defend myself, right? But at the same time, there's a difference between like, okay, I have to defend myself, and then there's like people who go out and just kill other people, right? And there's where like some people there's certain nuances in the Bible, even that some people sometimes misinterpret. Um, Sometimes talk about the whole dehumanizing thing. That's the whole thing about the do not murder command, right? And why it's specifically do not murder, because of course some killing, obviously God had to make it okay, because people have to kill animals to eat, but animals don't hold the same status as humans, so you can't dehumanize an animal, um, at least logically speaking, um, because animals aren't humans in the conventional sense. Um, and so they're not made in the image of God, so they're not human in that sense either, right? So there are certain nuances, but then of course one of the nuances in the Bible, or the nuances that the Bible implies, is that like you're allowed to kill a guy who's about to commit murder, right? The Bible actually makes that okay, because the logic here is, once again, the murderer has already dehumanized all these people, so that's why he's going to go kill them. But you have a moral obligation to stop that from happening, because you cannot join the murderer in dehumanizing those people, right? So you have an obligation to stop him. You have an obligation to stop a murderer, because you have to protect the lives of others, right? And that's why we love heroes, right? That's why we love superheroes, because superheroes do exactly that, right? They stop evil people from dehumanizing others. That's the reason why we love That's why we love superheroes, right? Because superheroes stand up for the humanity of others, right? I mean, that's why Spider-Man is once again, Spider-Man is one of the most popular comic book characters, because Spider-Man is hated by like the press because Jonah's kind of a douche, um, but that doesn't matter, right? Sure, he can be hated by the media, and he's kind of a dork, right? And Peter Parker was bullied in school before he became Spider-Man. I mean, he's still bullied because he's a nerd. But then Peter Parker, and this is what makes him such a great character, right? Is that how much he upholds the humanity of others, that he's willing to protect everybody if he can, right? Um, because it's about elevating the humanity in others, right? And that's something that is a very important Christian call, right? That we uphold the humanity of others. Um, but of course, at the same time, when it comes to like I use the whole feeding the drug addict guy story. There's obviously limits, because you cannot do it at the expense of dehumanizing yourself, right? Which is a very dangerous temptation many Christians run into. Um, but you cannot you should elevate other people's humanity, but you cannot dehumanize yourself as a cost, because I believe Jesus himself said it. What's the point of gaining the whole world when you've given up your own soul, right? And that's the importance of our humanity, right? Because yes, we have sin. Yes, we've all made a lot of mess ups. I mean, that's the beauty of reading Genesis 18 as well, right? To go back to it, Abraham's an idiot, but God elevates his humanity despite the fact he's an idiot, right? And so, you know, if God values humanity that much that he can forgive Abraham's idiocy, God loves our humanity so much that he died, to cleanse us of our sin, to elevate our humanity, right? That means you should never take, you know, someone's humanity lightly. And that's why it is such a grievous sin to dehumanize someone else. Right? And so I think that's the major takeaway from the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And I really wanted to cover that because I know there's a lot of misconceptions about that story and about what was the real purpose of destroying Sodom and Gomorrah was because of how openly people dehumanized others. And God cannot stand for that. And he will never stand for that. As we see in other parts of the Bible, he's willing to wipe out other people because they do exactly that crime, right? And so he even threatens Israel to do it, um, you know, because of times when they have dehumanized others. And he's like, I'm gonna wipe your asses off the face of this planet, um, because God takes, humanity very seriously. I mean, that's why Genesis starts with God creating humans in God's image, right? Is because there's a reason why humanity is so precious, right? And it's something that we should always be mindful of. And it's an important part in the middle of Abraham's story, because Abraham's arc is the reminder of how much God, elevates our humanity within the context of Genesis. And I think that's the hero's journey of Abraham. And I'll talk obviously more about it next week as I finish Abraham's story. But I think on this note, I actually want to end it. I know I'm kind of not going to talk about the rest of chapter 19, but after I did that whole almost hour long talk about humanity and how important it is and how much God loves it, I think that's a good way to end the stream actually and to end this lecture. Um, I hope that you know it's something for you to really consider as well. And once again, I hope you read the passages for yourself, right? And really dwell on this and meditate on this. Um, you know how much God loves our humanity and how much He gives for it, right? And the Christianese words would be that Jesus died for it, right? So God obviously holds incredible value to our humanity, and so don't ever sell yourself short in that regard. But at the same time, it's all the more reason, we should be grateful to Him, and you know should lead us to worship at times, right? Because that's such an amazing thing for God to want to preserve. And I think that's something that we should always remember and think about and build our lives on even. But anyway, I'm going to end it on that somber but positive note. I'm not going to talk about the rest of chapter 19. Read it for yourself, right? And you can come up with your other observations. But I think I made the most important one really. So it's almost 6 o'clock. It's like 5:45, well 5:47, but you know, give or take, right? Um, so I gotta head out actually. But with that being said, I'm gonna end the stream here, and I hope that you guys learned something. I hope you guys really know how to appreciate your Bibles better and appreciate the Word of God, and you know appreciate you know how much God loves you despite who you are. Because obviously He can love Abraham, He can love anyone. So um, that's my last jab at the guy, at least for this week. But uh, with that being said, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. God bless you.